Welcome to Peak, a growth sport production that explores the power of culture on organizational performance. For show notes and more information, visit our website at growth-sport.com. Now let's get started on your drive for peak performance.
Welcome to Peak, the official podcast of Growth Sport. I'm running alone again today. My trusty colleague, Mary Claire, is out with her family on vacation. So this will be a shorter episode today, but I want to dive a little bit further into some of the things that we've been talking about lately. As you remember, we've been talking about this gap that exists between leaders and the front line and how they understand change. And, just coming back to the importance of change, we all know that it's very critical that we can pursue that change and the innovation that is required to stay competitive. The problem, as we recognized last time, is that there's a gap between what the leadership can expect with change and what the front line will tolerate with change. And what we found is that almost 70% of leaders are okay with significant change, but only about 40% of followers are equally willing to go down that change path. So what that does is it creates different groups of people on the front line, some who are willing to change, some who won't change under any circumstances, and a large group that we call waiters, people that are waiting to see what happens before they make the change. In effect, these waiters become an obstacle to change because they are waiting for the change to happen before they make a change. And unfortunately, that puts them in the category of people not helping the change, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy. But there are some other statistics that are equally challenging. One is to recognize that only about 40% of the work that the front line does upper leadership really even know about or understand. The other interesting statistic is that 67% of leadership feel like the front line knows and understands the strategic direction. But when the front line is asked this question, only 2% will respond that they know what the strategic intent of leadership is. This is a tremendously large gap, and this gap causes all kinds of problems. One of the big issues is that leadership assumes that there is no gap. The front line often recognizes the gap, but has no mechanism to actually communicate that there is a gap. So it'd be interesting to actually dive into both of those issues. Let's start first of all with leadership. If I'm a leader and I understand that there is a gap, I treat things differently than if I don't. If I don't understand there's a gap, then I charge ahead with these changes, expecting that everyone can see all of the reasons why they should follow, why they should be a part of the change, when in fact, they can't see this and they don't want to follow because they don't understand exactly what we're trying to do. If, on the other hand, I recognize that there's a gap, I'm going to spend some preparatory time creating and facilitating a bridge across that gap. And what I mean by that is that if I understand that people don't immediately understand the strategic reasons for what we're doing, I'm going to take some time to actually make sure that those strategic intent issues are clear and that they are well understood. Now, this comes all the way back to the things we've talked about a lot with strategic alignment. And if we can get strategic alignment where the front line understands what leadership is trying to accomplish, then we can close this gap a little bit. We can get to a point where we can have a conversation where the front line can ask questions and make sure that everybody is on the same page. Now, if you go to the other side and you say the front line sees the gap, but has no way to really communicate that to leadership, leadership isn't really listening. And so what they tend to do at this point, and we talked about this in our last episode, is they tend to slow roll things. They tend to be passive aggressive with respect to what's trying to be done. As a leader, you can see these things. If you are trying to implement change and you understand what needs to be done, but those things aren't happening, it's time to dive into that a little more deeply. There's a lot of good examples of this. You can see where the front line is taking too much time, where they're not really working hard to try to make things happen. At this point, rather than force or demand certain outcomes, leadership can take a step back and start to ask the important questions. What do they understand? Why do they think this change is happening? And you can just ask these questions of your front line. In fact, I found these to be very effective if you get the front line together and say, why don't you tell me why you think we're doing this change? A lot of times you'll get, I don't know, or I have not been told. And then even there you can say, why do you think? What would be your best guess? and see if they can see or understand the strategic intent and how well you've communicated that. And these might be opportunities to then clarify what that strategic intent is for the front line. These opportunities create a culture of transparency. They also create social capital. The front line feels like they're heard, and leadership can feel like they are actually being able to communicate the key vision and the key strategic intent that the front line needs to understand and know. All right, let's talk a little bit about this 2% number. I don't know about you, but for me, that seems incredibly small. Really, only 2% of the front line understands what the strategic intent is. And I'll bet that most leaders feel like they've communicated strategic intent ad nauseum. So why is that number so small? I think one reason is that the front line doesn't see themselves as needing to understand the strategic intent. So oftentimes when people are talking about strategy, it's bouncing off people's heads. They're not really internalizing or taking it in. They don't feel the need or the reason to understand that and to apply that. They say a lot of times, I'm just going to go do my job. I know what my job is and I'm going to go do that. The challenge here is that that's actually not true. The front line does need to know what the strategic intent is, and they need to understand what things need to change in order to reach that strategic intent. But to make that happen, they need to understand how what they do matters to that strategic intent. It needs to be connected. And so in this case, we need to spend a little bit more time not just communicating the strategic intent, but communicating how the daily actions of the front line impact the strategic intent and what might need to change. This brings us full circle back to process. We've talked a lot about why it's so important to connect the strategic intent to the daily execution through process. But if we can do this effectively, and we like to do it through KPAs, key performance activities, and game reviews, then I can get to a point where I understand how what my daily activities and behaviors are and how these behaviors and activities actually impact the strategic intent. This leads to all kinds of really positive outcomes. It leads to engagement because the people understand how what they do impacts the outcomes that we seek to accomplish. It leads to innovation because I can also see, once I understand how what I do matters, what isn't working, and what I might need to do differently. And if I have space to fail or space to try, then I can also articulate some of those things that I might want to do differently and try those things and see if that matters. If leadership gives your front line that kind of added space to try and do those things, then you'll get really different outcomes than you've gotten in the past. Now let's talk a little bit about this statistic that upper leadership only knows about 40% of the activities that the front line is doing. This is actually a huge disconnect between what leaders think they know and what they actually know. If you were to talk to most leaders, they would tell you they know everything that's happening at the front line. And even if they are completely honest with themselves, they might tell you that they know 75% of what's going on at the front line. But to know less than half of what's going on at the front line as an actual number is concerning. It shows that the hubris of the leadership to think they know what's happening is actually causing problems. Because if I, as a leader, think that I know what's happening and actually I only know what 40% is happening, I'm probably making decisions about what's working or not working or what needs to change that are incorrect or at least incomplete. So how do we fix this? Again, we come back to process. If we get to a weekly accountability session where the front line is talking about what they're doing and leadership is listening to what's actually happening, then you're going to have a much higher percentage understanding of the actual behaviors and activities that are taking place. At the same time, the front line feels heard. They feel like what they are doing matters and that leadership cares. And then oftentimes when the changes come, it helps the front line because they feel like, well, leaders have been listening and they understand what we're doing. And so these changes take these things into account. The very worst thing that can happen is when a frontline worker hears about changes that obviously haven't taken into account the workflows and the work processes that person is involved in on a day-to-day basis. That's a very frustrating and very debilitating kind of outcome. It makes me feel like I'm not important enough that somebody takes the care to understand what I'm doing. So again, these linkages, if you really think about it, clarity in an organization comes from linkages. And it's so interesting because most of the time when we're with a company and we're working with them, the very first complaint they have is we need to improve our communications. And you can see why this is true. People just don't understand what other people are doing or how they're working. But the way you improve communications is to create specific process links for that communication to happen. Because if you're just waiting for it to happen organically at the water cooler, it's never going to be sufficient. It's never going to be detailed enough, and it's never going to be often enough. So what you need to do is create those processes by which that communication happens. And in our case, doing this weekly game review is critical because it allows everybody to have their part and communicate their part on a weekly basis so that there can be feedback. This is what's working, not working. This is what I like, I don't like. This is what's happening based on the things that we're doing. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you all for joining us. If you like this podcast, we invite you to like and share it on Spotify or Apple or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, if you have questions that you would like to have us address on this podcast, please shoot us a note. You can contact me at brian@growth-sport.com. That's BRYAN at growth-sport.com. And we'll try to address some of those questions on our podcast. So until next time, we hope that your quest for peak performance is successful. We'll see you later.
You've been listening to Peak, a Growth Sport production.